Having me. It's very much a pleasure to be here. Uh, Along with being the head of global delivery here at uTest, I actually have about 14 years in R&D experience, mostly in quality assurance, actually. So this presentation itself should speaks from my heart in a lot of ways. Now, unfortunately, I also committed cardinal sin and tried to communicate too much in the presentation, especially given the amount of time we have now. So I might jet through a few things, definitely hit the salient points, and then, of course, we'll save some time for question and answer at the end. So without further ado, if I can, okay. We're going to, our very quick agenda today, we will be talking about crowdsourcing in general, because there are people of various degrees of knowledge on the call. We'll talk about crowdsourcing, we'll get into why we need it for testing, we'll discuss some crowdsourcing testing approach is right for you, some myths about implementing it, and then talk a little bit about the specific approach that uTest has. And then certainly we'll have some Q&A at the end. So who we are. Well, for those of you not familiar, uTest is the world's largest provider of in-the-wild testing services. We provide 5 different types of services using a community of testing experts from around the world, which include functional, usability, load, security, and localization testing. So for those of you who think crowdsourcing is for beta testing, we have other options. So since our launch in 2008, we've amassed a community of over 100,000 testers in over 200 countries. We actually test on mobile, web, and desktop, and we have all manner of customers, and we've run over 30,000 testing projects. And so what's crowdsourcing? Well, if you believe Jeff Howe, is taking a service traditionally performed by a person or team and sourcing it to a large online group of people as an open project. Now, I would never disagree with Jeff, but in today's context, you'll learn that that is one way to look at crowdsourcing. But if it depends on what you really want out of the crowd or the community or the expert that's coming from outside of your firewall to determine what type of, in today's industry, what type of crowdsourcing you really mean. And there's lots of different types. In fact, if you just think about crowdsourcing in general, there's many different types of industries being represented. You have, although I don't think Dig should probably be on here anymore, you have support, you have photo stock, you have development, you have reviews. Wiki even is a form of crowdsourcing, really. But with all those, there's a lot of companies involved in the space of crowdsourcing in general, and why not, right? I mean, after all, you can get specialized skill sets that aren't on your balance sheet, and you can increase and decrease at scale very, very quickly. I mean, obviously there are some drawbacks and some downsides of crowdsourcing, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little while, but for the most part, it's an untapped market out there of people that have the expertise you need that can do projects when you need them. And they can be everyone from, as I mentioned a little bit, from a mom and pop to someone who is an expert in their field. And so there's lots of good benefits to it. But what are the benefits within crowdsourcing? Well, for testing, well, I think the first thing you need to think about is what problems are we facing today in the area of testing. And I think the biggest starting block here is most of us grew up in a testing world where we were testing for applications that were mainly being used by a restricted group or audience on a fairly restricted set of platforms. I mean, even if you think about web in '98, you're really looking at a handful or more of really popular browsers, and most of the stuff was still being used inside a firewall. And we moved out with e-commerce and things. We started moving out later in the 2000s and whatnot. But I think we'll all agree that a majority of our users, even in-house users, tend to not live inside the same confines of our lab or inside our firewall, and they're actually outside. And so lab testing is very vital, but your customers aren't there, and that's not where their challenges are. Their challenges are how do they use your products and applications outside where you can't replicate their environments in-house. Again, thinking about environments, the testing matrix from a few years ago was fairly large and scary then, but if you consider this matrix here, is only showing you Android devices only. It's not even counting the number of OS versions and carriers and locations This is just the Android devices on the market today. Okay, so it's a very big testing matrix, and if you think about that, doesn't even include, the various versions of Android. I mean, you're really looking at a very large testing matrix indeed, and you can't possibly stuff all that inside of four walls of your office. Now, take that and couple it with, especially when it comes to mobile, users are very much less tolerant of spotty quality. They have low switching costs to go between one product to another. And social and app stores give them really a megaphone to air their complaints. I was meeting with a company this week in Dallas, and they're a public transit company, and they're getting beaten up because they've launched this very, very exciting and very difficult to test product out to a number of users, and they have some tens of thousands of users, but here are 17 users on Android 4.0.3 that are complaining about usage, and because that handful complain in the app stores, this team is getting beaten up because of it. And it's a handful of thousands, but yet they're the vocal minority. And so this might sound familiar to a lot of you. But crowdsource testing can help. So there are thousands of companies that have moved towards this, and why? Because the exponential spike in devices and operating systems and browsers, because bad connectivity and imperfect connectivity, because we're putting more power and more information in the hands of people that we don't understand or know the intent of their usage of our products, because customers are less patient, and they can be much more vocal. These companies have felt that they need to get out and test where their consumers are. They need to test in the labs for sure. They need to use automation for sure. There's lots of things that we've done in the past that we need to continue to do. But how could that company in Dallas know that their application, although beautifully designed and look really pretty inside their office with the dim lights, the actual color choices they used and the actual way they were displaying the ticket information on the device wasn't going to work in a bus where the ticket holder or the fare checker was trying to check in a moving bus in the bright sunlight of Dallas. It just didn't work, and they wouldn't have known that, and they didn't know that, and they launched, unfortunately, with some blemishes and some problems. And why? Because they didn't get out into where the consumers were as much as they needed to. And so they recognized that, and so there's the other companies. So what's really crowdsourcing going to allow us to do? Well, if we think about in the lab testing, we have manual testing, we have outsourced testing, we have automation. All these things are very, very important. But they really don't get us to the geographies that people live in, through the other countries and stuff that we're trying to support, especially in the global economies. They're really not going to help us get all the proliferation of devices that are there, or operating systems. Even browsers and the technology and the way people can even use location-safe services on browsers is even more important today than it was before. And various carriers. We have a customer who that sells concert tickets, and they were working, and they had one of their actual employees over in the UK, and he said, "I can't buy tickets." They said, "There's no way that's going to be possible. We've tested this product inside and out. We know you can buy tickets." He's like, "I can't." So eventually they flew a developer to the UK from the US. He met up with that customer, or that tester, or sorry, I keep going back, tester, that employee. He said, "Give me that device." And sure enough, he tried to do the test, and it wouldn't work. Now what it turned out was that the carrier that guy was on was blocking a particular packet that was required for the purchasing process. And they never would have found that issue without having someone actually there. And so they were losing tens and thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars on this particular problem, and they didn't even realize it. So In-the-Wild gives you that and other things. But the question then becomes, what type of crowdsource testing, if you need this sort of work, what sort of crowdsource testing is best for you? Well, it comes down to this. This is a crowd. A crowd is and often acts like an unruly mob. So how do you get them to go from this to this? How do you get them to delivering a skilled service predictably and with a community to get producing? Basically, you need to create a community out of the crowd to produce desired results. Now, in order to do that, you have a few choices. You can use more of an open crowd, like Jeff has spoke about, where you have people who are not necessarily matching your profile. So let's think of more like a mechanical Turk, where you want to put out a project to them and you ask them and you pay them fairly low rates, and you're looking for some semblance of data coming back. But it's not as predictable, but it's easy to get up and going, and it's a nice way to get a hold of lots of people fairly quickly. But you have to manage that and take care of it. And as a company, you're taking that crowd and you're turning it into the community. Okay. Now, if we went to the right, though, there's companies that actually have test-specific crowds. 99test comes to mind, or others. Mob for Hire. These are companies that have been in the space for a little while, and they have test-specific crowds that they've set up. But they lack a certain community to them in many cases, or a way to manage a management overlay that helps take care of these things. So the next step up is more of test-specific community. So not only am I looking for, on the left side, just people. The green, I'm looking for people who are testers. In the specific community, I'm actually looking for testers of particular skills that are going to return to my project week after week and month after month. And I want to build a team of people that I can count on to help test my products. And as we move further to the right, you get more and more support from the company helping turn that crowd into a community for you, as opposed to you having to figure out how to do it yourself. And trust me, after 4 years of doing this, there's a lot of secret sauce to getting a community to do what you need them to do. And I'm sure that'll come up in a little bit. And if you get farthest to the right, actually, you're getting out of what Jeff would consider crowdsourcing. You're getting to more expert sourcing. You're getting to people like, I don't just want a specific test skill. I want a specific person. I want the guy that was speaking at the conference last week on testing practices, best practices, on how to use Selenium in my environment. I want him to come to my office and work on my project or work remotely. And this is when we start getting into very single source stuff with people that are experts. And it starts, just for your information, uTest sort of lives in this bucket. We do everything from the specific crowd over to the expert sourcing. But in order to pick out which one of these is right for you, there's a few things you should know about yourself. First, you should think about what task are you trying to actually create. And I try to put a little grid here together for you. On the bottom left, if you're looking at on the y-axis, you're looking at mob sourcing versus expert sourcing. Mob would be similar to what I called open crowd on the left side of the previous page. Or you have one sourcing on the x-axis versus team sourcing. Now, team sourcing would be more like the community approach, versus one sourcing would be, again, more like I want one single person to do the work for me. And so if you really get into what you're trying to do, are you looking for automation and performance and usability professionals and expertise? Then you're really looking to one source, a particular expert. But if you're looking for doing more beta type testing, then you're typically more looking for mob source team sourcing. Okay, so a group of people that are doing something for you. Where we typically play, as far as in test, what we've seen most successful is either using a group of experts to do team sourcing for functional localization and security testing, or a combination of the grid of the experts of the find a specialist and attract a group. When you put those two together, they also come up to the top right. Hopefully that makes sense. So first of all, you got to think about, what am I actually trying to accomplish? If I want beta testing, then I probably need a different type of solution out of the crowd than I need if I want to have a combination of if I want to recruit a skilled team. The next thing to think about is, what's my competition doing? So, for example, is quality something that they are differentiating themselves from you with, or is it an opportunity for you to differentiate yourself? Is it, how much does your market require you to do in the target market to prove that you're better than your competition, or vice versa? Second question to ask yourself is, what is your risk profile for quality? And that sort of leads into the first question, which is, can I launch a product? So say I'm Twitter. I can get a product out the door, at least I could a few years ago, and I really only care about features. That's Google, Twitter, Facebook, they've all gone through this, even Netflix, where it was all about features and it was all about getting across devices as fast as I possibly could, or getting out to my target market as fast as I could. I would give up perfect quality or even good quality in a lot of cases to give a free product to a customer and get them using it. You could have a P3, P4 bug. I would want to fix it, but I'm not going to because I'd rather be spending my time on a new feature. That was the risk profile then. But the risk profile now for many of these companies is actually, you know what? I need to retain these customers also. I need to retain them. I'm getting more and more competition. Netflix is a great example. I got more competition now. So now it's not just about, am I on the device? It's a deep quality experience I need to have on the device to keep them from moving over to Amazon Prime or keep them from moving for Crackle or other products. And they've realized that, and they've had to change their testing practices as a result. So it's about their competition and their risk profile. And then again, regarding competition, there are tools in the market, like this one that we actually have, it's called Applause, which allow you to understand what consumers are saying about you and know how you compare against your competition. And you can see areas here and you say, well, if it's about, in this particular example, you can see that the gray lines indicate how well Airbnb is doing on their Android app versus these 10 attributes of quality. And if you look at the little black marks, those are how their competitors are doing as a mean. So they can say, well, in pricing, which is something that community doesn't have anything to do with, I really don't need crowdsourcing, but I'm also doing very well on that. But if I look at stability, well, that is something, or interoperability, that's something that I could use crowdsourcing for. And so they might be a good example of someone who could use it because they're looking at their competition and saying, how can I catch the competition? And crowdsourcing testing is one of the ways they could do that or help invest in that. The next thing I would recommend is to know thyself. Look, if your culture is cautious and risk averse, then it's going to be hard for you to implement something as seemingly radical as crowdsourcing is. At least do it effectively. Now, luckily for you, crowdsourcing, especially for testing, has been around for, well, we started really in testing about 5 years ago, and the market has been getting more and more educated. But if you're in a typically adverse, cautious, and risk-averse company, this may not be. You may not have a lot of stakeholders that are willing to support you in this. Also, if you're in a highly regulated industry like defense or pharma or banking, it's also going to be a particularly tough sell because of all the regulations. Because think about it, you're trying to get people outside of your firewall to work and test on your products, but they're not employees of yours or employees of the person you're contracting, which is a company like uTest or one of these other crowdsourcing companies. They're contractors that are establishing a relationship with you to them, not from you to, say, uTest. And I can talk more about that at the end, but this is something you should be cognizant of. The other question is, do you have an appetite for innovation, and do you have the budget to do it correctly? People, when they think of crowdsourcing, they often think of the far left and the idea of Mechanical Turk. Well, that's great, and you can pay people for pennies, but you're not going to get the results that you're necessarily looking for if you want that expert. You need to realize that you're actually paying probably a premium because you're using these people for a fairly short period of time or when you need them. And so you need to make sure that the budget is adequate when you go into thinking about crowdsourcing. It is not mom and pop for a penny. In fact, oftentimes when you're trying to get the guy who spoke at that conference, you're going to be spending a fair penny to get him, but at least you don't have to keep him on your books all the time. It's more of a contractor. If you're trying to build a team of people that you're going to use twice a week and not every single day, in the long run you're saving money, but you need to have the budget to do so. Okay, so which one's best? Well, it depends on what you want to do. They each have their pros and cons, and so as I mentioned on the Opens Crowd part, it's self-managed. Anyone can participate. Skills may vary and results may vary, but it's a limited barrier to entry, and it is a good way to get out to target market quickly, or out to a market quickly. If you move to the right, you get more white glove, you get vetted participation, exact skills, and exact results. Much more predictable, but it comes at additional costs. But that's probably, that may be what you needed. And of course, across the spectrum, you can move these sliders, left and right as you need to make sure you're making the right choice. But it's not that simple, right? I mean, there are lessons that have been learned, and let me share a few of those with you right now. First, as I mentioned, cost is something that people sometimes don't consider. They often think that, well, this lesson has staff required, so it's less overhead. Well, the truth is, a good crowdsourcing testing solution should complement and scale as needed. It's not meant to replace the inside team. It's meant to let the inside team focus on the bits and bytes and the hard stuff, the user flows, the algorithms and things that have been created to make sure the system itself is functioning at a technical level very well, and let the community make sure it's functioning outside your firewall very well or similar. In addition, so the best practice here is really building strengths around your core competencies and figuring out where the crowd fits into your team. Outside the lab, taking over repetitive tasks, providing fresh eyes. Many of us have suffered from tester fatigue in the past, and it's amazing when you let somebody else utilize your product. Oftentimes, it happens to be one of the executives that gets a hold of it, and then next thing you know, you get a bunch of no-worky bugs because they used it in some way you hadn't intended. Well, instead of doing that, you can utilize people outside of your core group to test on it, and very quickly use their fresh eyes to do things that you would never, and use their gray matter to exercise the product in a way you never would have intended, and they'll find those bugs for you and give them to you in a repeatable, in a way that can be identified with repeatable steps and actions very, very quickly. I'll talk about how we do that later. Another thing to think about is a myth around, do we need to own the results? Well, the truth is intellectual property is a legitimate issue, and if you're using crowdsourcing for copyright or for design or animation or code writing, then you do really need to understand what the IP protection policies are. If you're using things for like testing and other types of activities like those, then there's really less IP concerns as far as who owns the deliverables. Clearly you do. But in order to understand this, you really need to establish the ground rules and make sure you understand the policies of the companies you're working with, and just make sure that's part of what you're thinking about. So here's a question we get a lot. It says, we're in stealth mode. There's no way we could work with a community. Well, confidentiality is a serious matter. But crowdsourcing is often used for pre-launch products. In fact, with companies that we've worked with and talked to and polled, the majority of leaks of information and IP have actually happened through the employees much more than a vetted and trusted community. Now, that being said, you really do need to be upfront about this with whichever vendor you're looking to work with, and make sure that precautions, NDAs, and what else are taken, you understand how those work, you understand how they are going about to protect your information. I mean, personally, we work with companies. It's funny, I'll be working with like a banking company or someone else who is very concerned about and protecting their IP, and we have tools and technologies to help ensure that the thing under test doesn't get out to anyone we don't want it to. But for me, the risk of IP from them getting out is very minimal because there's not that big of a market necessarily for that information. On the other hand, we're testing products like pre-launch second screen for movies, where we're getting to see deleted scenes and alternative endings. We're getting to see movies and games before they even hit the market. Those are things that people would line up in streets for 4 days to wait to find out the information that we possess in the community, and yet we've had no breaches. Why? Because if you work with if you've talked about this up front with your customer and you know how secure it needs to be, then often the crowd can be used in a way that will protect your IP. The last one is all vendors are equal. Well, that is a myth a lot of people have, and of course, I don't think it's true. So when selecting a vendor, obviously we would never hire someone without references, and we need to realize that is true here as well. Second thing, we need the ability to adapt to your legacy. Companies should be able to adapt to your legacy system. You shouldn't have to change the way you're doing business to necessarily utilize them. Sometimes it makes sense to do so, but for the most part, you should be able to use the same systems and processes you're using today. You should also make sure they can satisfy your legal requirements and ability to do the job. Now, ability to do the job does not mean that they say, absolutely, I can do it. I mean, heck, if you go back to the last 4 years ago, I probably would have told you, sure, we can do that, and never have done it before. I've learned a lot since then. Now, companies need to have a very predictable onboarding process, and if they tell you that you're going to get perfect results from the first go-round, then they're probably not telling you the truth. Because just like bringing up a person inside your own company who is going to sit next to you and ask you questions and log a bug, and you're going to say, yeah, that is a bug, but it's not a bug I care about. I really want these things, or you're going to educate them on the job every single day. But it still takes them months to ramp up in many occasions. Well, it's very similar. You're trying to bring someone else outside of your firewall as well. If this person's never used your products before or only has used them as a consumer, and then you're asking them to test, you can't expect them on day one to test like you do. You have to bring them along. And so we've found that there's various degrees, depending on how complex the project is, about how much training they need ahead of time and how long they need to ramp up. But there's still going to be a ramp-up period. So if someone tells you there's not a ramp-up period, then I'd be a little cautious. Or you're really looking for, you're really not, don't have very many specific requirements, I guess, if that's the case. Okay. So uTest and the crowd. So what are we doing that's different than that? And again, I'll get through this part, and then we'll be on to questions. Well, what uTest does to on-ramp and to become with a new customer, and how we try and differentiate ourselves, and what we've learned over the years, is that we really have to profile our community very well for testing. Although the idea of utilizing an open crowdsourced platform and putting a project out for people seems interesting and useful, the truth is you typically want to target your market of testers much more precisely. Especially when you're talking about geolocation type services, or you're talking about localization type services, you really want to make sure that you're picking people in the right countries. So the community of testers should be profiled down to demographics, geography, and technical aptitude, technical at the least. Then it would be helpful for you to get into what industries they work in, what technologies they understand. Are they engineers? Are they not? The usability experts, security, what specific skills they have should all be in the community profile. And so we've gone to long lengths to do that. In fact, we actually have an entire community management team just making sure that this is accurate information and that we're getting the right types of people into our community and they're trained effectively. In addition, we have found that in order to incent someone to do the work that you want them to do, they're not employees, they're not contractors to you. It's not like you can say, hey, go do this, and they're going to go do exactly what you want. You need to be able to have a model that incents them. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the model on the future page, but you have to really look in the incentive models and have ratings associated to it so you can judge how well they're doing and make sure that the right people are getting to the right projects. This comes down to precise matching as well. So is the person I'm using for this particular project the right one? It may have been great for me on the last project, but it may not be on the next one. And so you have to have matching algorithms, sort of like a dating site, to make sure that you're getting the right testers for each project. And finally, we've learned that you really do need a bit of a service layer. It's not, as I mentioned earlier, it's not as intuitive as you would think to get someone who is outside of your company or not a contractor directly to you to do work the way you intend them to do it. You would think it would be, but it's not, because really you're talking about people who have other jobs typically and are doing this nights and weekends. They're usually working on projects for a couple of hours at a time. So you have to appeal to them in certain ways. You have to draw up projects in the way things are going to be done in certain ways. And you also have to make sure that they are being properly incented and taken care of. So we've learned that a management overlay on top of the services, on top of the platform itself, is critical to the success of our customers. Now, the varying degrees of management overlay, depending on who the company is and what they're trying to accomplish, but in all situations, at least for onboarding, if not through the remainder of the program, And for as many years as we've been with companies, and we've been with some companies for 4 years, it's important to have that management overlay. Other things, crowdsourcing, as I said, is a variety of, can be done in a variety of ways. And so we've learned that you do need the diverse community. You do need a specifically trained community. So we have, for many of our customers, including some of you who are on the phone, I'm not allowed to mention your names. You guys were building very specific communities that are trained on how to test your products. Then you have a dedicated offsite capability and a dedicated on-site capability if you need people to come in and provide you short-term staffing solutions, or the ability to utilize the crowd in the most effective way. We'll also provide those things. Once we've done all this, the way it really works is you specify testing needs. You select testers and invite them. So once you've identified the needs, the platforms, whether ours or anyone else's, should select the appropriate testers based on those matching algorithms. The testers would then read what they're asked to do. They agree to any terms. They would log their reports in real time into a triaging system, which is the platform that we have. The bugs are then approved by the customer or us, depending on the requirements, and they've already been pre-triaged. And the good news about crowdsourcing, and think whether it's us or anyone else, the really good news about it is you can set up a relationship with someone in another country without ever having to worry about how you pay them. So imagine we were asked to test a rollout in the UK and South America for a particular product, and it was a mobile streaming application. They needed people in 42 countries, and it would have, just the legal cost alone of setting up all those relationships, all the different vendors required to do that, would have been insane if you had to do it in the old ways. Or, imagine worse, having to ship somebody on a plane, which is what these guys actually did the first time, to all these countries to verify it. Whereas with a crowdsourcing move, you can actually get this done, all the relationships and the payments are all set up ahead of time, and you can actually switch a project like that on in a week or less, because you're not having to deal with all that legal stuff. So anyway, that's how that all works. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit more about the reputation, because this is really critical. You must have a performance management solution, is what we believe, in order to get this done right. It needs to be monetary-based and reputation-based. And it needs to reward people for their skills and how well they do. Not everyone's equal. Some bugs are better than other bugs. We have a belief that, if you log a bug that's more likely that the customer values more, you should get paid more. And if you're a gold-rated tester, you should get more money and more opportunity. It's a meritocracy, shall we say. So these are really important, and I'm sure we'll ask some questions about that in a second. Why do you benefit? Well, whether it's us or through other people, if they're following these similar things, you're really benefiting from in-the-wild testing, getting outside of your environment. You get all that coverage and all those devices. You're not paying for contracts or the devices, and they get refreshed. Think about it in the U.S. If you're a crowd tester in the U.S., every time you go buy a new device, it's a tax write-off, because it's part of your home business if you've set yourself up appropriately. So they're always wanting to get to the latest thing. And face it, we're all geeks. We want the latest, coolest device. Fast time to market. You can get cycles up and running. We could have been testing something by the time we got done with this call. We could already had a project up and running and already had bugs coming back in. Lower cost. Get people when you need them. Project-based. You can do subscriptions for economies of scale. But that subscription, for example, could let you test. I want to test what, instead of setting up a standard SOW, which is very restrictive, you'd be able to test any 2 products you want at any time. You can be flexible. You want to test web and mobile today? You want to test Android and iOS? You want to test, this other website from your Korean company? You can do that. It's very flexible, because for us and for other companies, you're not really, or mainly for us, you're not restricting by a set of people that I've outsourced into, say, Vietnam, and it's only these 10 people that you choose from. I can have people in Spain, and then tomorrow France, and then tomorrow Japan, if necessary. Because that's how that's the flexibility crowdsourcing provides. Okay, so that sort of is my very quick spiel. Trying to leave enough time for discussion.
Great, thank you, John. We're going to open it up. I just want to make sure that all the attendees are able to talk. So you can unmute yourself if you have a question, or you can type it into the question box below. I'm assuming because each of you decided to join this webinar, you have some curiosities and questions on crowdsourced testing. John's an excellent resource, so please feel free to speak up and ask your questions at this point. So John, maybe just to get the Q&A started. So you talked a lot about mobile devices, but is crowdsourced testing, can you describe some other use cases for that other than mobile? John? Sorry, John, I think I had you on mute.
Ah, that's better.
Did you hear my question?
No, people probably wanted me to mute for a second anyway. So, yeah, people probably wanted me to mute anyway. Absolutely. So we currently about 70% of our business is mobile testing. You know, it's an area that of high growth for anybody, and it's a very complex matrix to try and hit. However, for example, we test every week for a e-tailer website in New York. They have 8 websites that they maintain, selling products that I'm sure a lot of you use. And every week they do a technology push to those sites, and a crowd can jump in within an hour or two and test all the major. They can test all the major flows across these 8 sites across all browser combinations that are relevant within a few hours. And it allows this company to have a lot of confidence that their revenue stream is not going to be impacted by the pushes they're making. Other examples would be, say, you're doing an international rollout of a website. Agencies do this all the time, or companies, and say, I want to go into a new market. Well, what better way to test your product than to actually have someone in Russia do the localization testing of your site for you and make sure it's going to work in their currencies with their credit cards on their operating systems and devices, even if it's mobile web, right? So it's actually tons of use cases for web. When it gets into things like hardware, hardware is also very useful. We do a test for a company where we are shipping SIM cards to Africa for various people in Africa to test an on-SIM application. We're doing a project where we have people that are actually athletes across the U.S. and Europe going out with heart rate monitors and watches and shoe devices to do various types of athletics to test a particular device technology. It's even prototyped. It's not even on the market yet. So crowds can be used for any number of things if you set up the right incentive models to do so.
Great.
Well, a few years ago, I had somebody, they had to go put GPS devices on top of their houses in Karachi and Fairbanks, Alaska, and various places around the world because we were testing a product that helped with global logistics and tracking shipments around the world. So it's really amazing what you can do once you figure out the right incentives.
Okay, we had a question from Lloyd. How targeted a crowd can uTest provide? For example, if software is targeted specifically for the steel fabrication industry, how big of a steel fabrication crowd could you get?
That's a very interesting question. So if a product is meant for a homogeneous sort of situation, so everyone's using the same technology to access the application, or they're doing it within the same company or within very few number of actual users around the world that would be using this product, then crowdsourcing may not be the right solution for it. It's not that you couldn't build a community around it. It's just the cost and time and expense versus the reward may be too much. And so I'd have to talk to that individual directly, but it is possible to build a community for almost anything. It just takes time and energy and an understanding of how to motivate them. So we have built communities for for companies where they needed to have a very specific skill, so around technologies. But again, it was a growing together type of project. You couldn't expect to step in on day one and have a very specific community like that. You can think about any crowd. The more filters you put on it, then the fewer people you're going to have at the beginning, because it's likely a supply that there hasn't been a great deal of demand for. But once the demand is there, then you can create the supply by giving them ongoing work. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, great. And another question, how would crowdsourcing fit in with an overall quality plan?
Right. So at the beginning, most companies would bring a community in or crowd in when a product's getting closer to launch and it's already been picked through fairly well by the internal team. You certainly wouldn't, if you have the internal team and you have the right infrastructure to do so, you wouldn't want to launch a community test until you are, and this is for functional by the way, until you are to a point where they're not going to be telling you things you already know. They're going to be able to exercise things on devices and find bugs, or not just devices, but even web or mobile or whatever. They're going to be finding things by executing flows that you hadn't expected by using exploratory testing in a lot of ways. So we'll get to that in a second. I'm sure that's going to come up. Now that being said, if you don't have that infrastructure, we have a lot of companies that we work with that, especially smaller ones, that we're working directly with the engineering department, and we're creating the test cases, we're providing the test management. It's a complete one-stop shop for testing for them because they don't already have the internal teams to do it, and they're really focusing on getting features out and not building up that capacity at this point. And this is typically some of our smaller customers. Although even some of our larger customers, we're actually bringing our people in-house into their company to take advantage of the community. And when we do that, of course, we can go farther up all the way into design and test architecture because we're there and working with them. So that's non-functional or functional. On the non-functional side, like usability, and when you're starting to employ expertise, as I mentioned, you could have a usability expert and a community of test subjects. Then the expert could be up even before any code's written, looking at, or a couple of UX experts could be looking at wireframes or design docs or whatever and helping even before development. So it really depends on what the usage and what you need and whether or not you're doing expert sourcing through the crowd or you're doing more of the community-based testing.
Okay, great. Also, will the slides be posted online? Great question.
Sure, we can make that available if you have a standard place to put those. We have a lot of case studies and things to get to, but I don't know if we have any online, although I'm sure we have plenty of presentations that have been videotaped before.
Okay, fantastic. And I can send that out to the people who registered for the webinar.
Great, sure.
All right, does anyone else have any more questions? All right, I don't see any hands raised. So, John, I just want to say thank you so much for taking your lunch to go over crowdsource testing. It was a great presentation, and we greatly appreciate your time.
Well, you're very welcome, and I'm honored to have so many people in attendance today. Obviously, I'm available for question and answer offline if you so desire. There's a lot more to cover. I apologize for trying to shove so much in one place, but thank you for being patient.
All right, fantastic. So we're going to conclude the webinar today. We thank everyone for your understanding, especially with the switch that had to happen at the beginning. I greatly appreciate your patience with that. So thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for upcoming webinars from the Q&A forum in the future.